Peg. You know Peg, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I think they're crazy, but
So we're supposed to go to Florida next week. I know.
Good evening and welcome to the March 10th, 2020 Guilderland Central School District Board of Education meeting. Would you all please silence your cell phones and stand for the pledge?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, first on the agenda, we have a personnel agenda to approve. Can I have a motion to approve the agenda, letter A? Barb, second. Rebecca? Any questions or comments? All in favor?
aye.
Aye. Passes 7-0.
And with that, we offer congratulations to our soon-to-be Assistant Superintendent for Human Resources, Mr. Regan Johnson. You can sit comfortably there tonight, but in a few months, all that will change.
Next on the agenda, we have a program report. Dr. Wiles?
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight. We're going to spend the next hour and a half or so reviewing the proposed school budget for the 2020-2021 school year. Before we get started, I want to make sure we recognize Mr. Neil Sanders, who has spent hours and hours on what you are about to see. I also want to recognize all of our administrative leaders who are in the back of the room who have also contributed greatly to putting together the budget for the draft budget for next year. Our format for tonight, we're going to spend the first part of our time really walking through the presentation, which you'll see before you, and Mr. Sanders and I will tag team that presentation. At the end, we'll go back and sit down in our regular seats and we'll open up the floor first to Board of Education members for questions that they might have, and then to anyone else who's here tonight who may have questions. So that's our plan for tonight. I'll just highlight kind of the agenda for the presentation itself. We're going to start really with an overview of our priorities and our process for the work we did to prepare for 2020, 2021. Then I'm going to hand things over to Mr. Sanders, who will review the financial context for our budget development, and he'll share a lot of the preliminary work that we've been doing for the last several months, some of which you've seen in the sneak previews of our budget vignettes that started way back in November. Next, he'll hand the podium back to me for a summary of the recommended proposals for next year. And then we'll talk about next steps in the budget development process, because this is really, although we've been working on it for months, it's really the first formal public part of our budget development process. And then as promised, we'll go on and talk about, give you an opportunity for questions and answers. So our work has really been driven by three big questions that are always guiding our work. We start with, so what do we care about? What are our priorities? What do we value? What are we trying to accomplish here in Guilderland? So as we made, and I will foreshadow very difficult decisions in putting together the budget, we always try to go back to what matters most to us. And then closely connected to that is, so what are our students' needs? And I know our leadership team can attest that they spend a lot of time looking very closely, sometimes student by student, at the kinds of needs that they have for support, that we can make sure that we are providing that support in our draft budget and however it becomes manifest for the next year. This third bullet became particularly challenging in this year, and there's a couple key words I would just want to highlight because they have made our work in this particular year more challenging. So yes, we have our priorities and yes, we have needs, but it was a tough question to say, so what can we actually afford? for right now, and then what can we sustain going forward? Because we're in a very difficult spot where Guilderland's revenue streams are quite limited and may continue to be quite limited, but our costs, even modestly, continue to rise. So we have to be very thoughtful about what we are proposing to go forward with, because we want to be able to sustain that into the future and not have to turn around in future presentations like this with even more challenging news. So, of course, we always start with our mission. Need I say more? Our mission is a lovely sentence, but you know by now I've shortened it to 4 words because everyone can remember them, and that's all kids, and all means all, every last one of them, and all of those students to be future ready. We can't prepare our children for our lives, we have to prepare them for their lives. And so how do we go about doing that day in and day out? And connected with that is our vision, which talks about our safe and welcoming schools, a community that works together to challenge students and to provide students opportunities. And that's the work that we're trying to find the resources to support and what we'll be talking about in tonight's presentation. So this presentation each year is that opportunity we have where we try to balance those 2 things, our mission and then the resources that are available to us. The mission we have, the resources are always the challenge. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. This year, when we asked our Board of Education members to weigh in on the budget, we did it using a thought exchange, a new tool that we have at our disposal to gather input from many, many audiences. And here's the top 10. The top 10 items that came back from their ideas about what is their priorities for next year. They shared those ideas, and then they had the opportunity to rate the ideas of one another. So a very eclectic list. Some things that can be addressed in a general operating budget, some things that need to be addressed outside of the budget in a capital project. I just want to draw everyone's attention to number 3. We've been talking a lot about this visioning for the future. And earlier in the school year, the board got together to talk about some goals that it has for itself going forward. And I didn't put them in a slide, but I want to remind everybody what they were, because when we think about our priorities, they're certainly part of that. The first priority, and I'm going to paraphrase and shorten them, had to do with serving all students, but with particular care for our students who are economically disadvantaged, because we have growing numbers of those students. The second one was to really think about our cultural responsiveness and the diversity of our student body, and how are we addressing that. The third had to do with professional development. And in the evening when we all met, we talked a lot about instructional coaching. I mention that now because I'm going to circle back to that later when we are wrapping up. The fourth had to do with cybersecurity and making sure we keep our systems and our data safe. And the fifth, one that comes up many times in 1 to 10, is to maintain and improve our facilities. So all important work that we wanted to keep in mind as we do our work in the budget. So here's our process. We start, the school year starts, and not long after that we are looking at the budget for the following year. So in the fall we spend time looking at the decisions we made last year in the spring of 2019 and how well are they working. Please do not worry about that baby crying. We love it. Talking, crying. It reminds us why we're here in a very visceral way, so do not worry. So the decisions we made almost a year ago, did they play out as we needed them to when students return to school in the fall? That's what we talk about then. Then we move into a detailed analysis of student needs. We look a lot at enrollment. We look at academic, social, and emotional support. And then we always keep in mind that we want to offer our students lots and lots of different kinds of opportunities, because those varied and interesting opportunities are what keep kids engaged in their learning. Of course, we do that in light of all the challenges that we have, and we had to think about this time increases and reductions in our spending plan based on essentially flat foundation aid and in the per pupil formula For 3 years in a row, we are in that middle class of school districts, that average wealth group of school districts in the state, who get the minimum amount of increase in state aid each year. It's a dubious distinction. It's a tiny amount of resources. We're in the same category as the Scarsdales and the Jerichos of New York State, who look nothing like Guilderland. But we are dealing with that trend coming into this year, and we'll see it going forward as well. We're all very familiar with the challenges of the tax levy limit. We've had it for several years now. It curtails the amount of revenue that we can generate. And then it's not a surprise. Things cost ever so slightly more from one year to the next. So we are dealing with higher costs connected to things like contractual obligations, retirement contributions, and so on. There are many others. So I'll say this about our budget before I hand things over to Neil. So overall, in the big picture, this program preserves existing programs and services for students. You don't see any program eliminated for any students in this budget. You'll see a couple additions in response to student needs or newly mandated requirements. That adage of no new unfunded mandates doesn't mean anything. We get them all the time. It does include reductions, and they're based to the best that we could, as much as possible, to minimize impact on students. And we looked at changing needs in order to make those tough decisions. We also, in this budget, took into consideration, whenever possible and appropriate, staff attrition. So if we had retirements or people who we know are resigning, we looked very closely at those positions and made some decisions so we would not impact adults either, or minimize the impact on adults. And then the last thing I'll say is that the budget we're proposing tonight does remain under our tax levy limit, and so it would require a simple majority of our voters for approval. And we'll talk a little bit more about that tax levy limit as the evening progresses. And so with that kind of big picture, I'll turn things over to Mr. Sanders.
Thank you, Dr. Wiles, and good evening. So what we're really talking about with the budget is the budget for next year, but we need to know where we are in the current year, and then we're working with changes from that. So just to remind everybody, our 2019-20 budget was approved on May 21st. It was $102,107,375. It passed by a plurality of 65.7%. The budget increase was 1.17%, and it was a tax rate decrease of 27.2%, and that was predominantly due to the revaluation that took place in the town of Guilderland. So some quick facts. Enrollment in the current school year, just over 4,900 students. We have 936 employees, 666 of whom are full-time and 270 who are part-time. We have 499 teachers, right on the cusp of 500. And in terms of support staff, we have 410, and administrators and supervisors, number 27, for a grand total of 936 staff. I'll just talk a little bit about enrollment, because this is the population we need to serve and make sure we have the resources for. So on the left, you'll see the elementary enrollment. That is going up 41 students for next year, it's projected. An increase of 37 students at the middle school level, and at the high school level, an increase of 6 students. So overall, that's 84 students that we're projecting to have in our district next year. Back in December, I shared a rollover budget projection. We do this at the start of every budget process to give us a sense as to what we might be facing as we look at the next year's budget. And what we're doing at that time is we're taking information that we can determine is accurate as of that time, which there's very little, and then a lot of estimating about where trends might go with salaries and benefits and other areas of the budget in terms of both expenses and revenues. So you can see from the chart at that time, where we're looking at a budget of going up almost $3.4 million overall in terms of our tax levy. So that's the amount of taxes we would have to raise. And that would be to fund the budget that we had looked at that time in terms of information that we had available and projections that we could make. I won't run through all of these categories. We're going to be talking about them as we look at the development of 2020-21 budget. All of these categories are in there. Many cases they played out in terms of increases and decreases. But just to set the stage for you a little bit, we were looking at a significant tax levy increase at that time in order to fund what we were able to determine in terms of an increase in expenditures of about $2.6 million and then a reduction in revenues of over $700,000. So some of the major factors influencing next year's budget in terms of state aid, as Dr. Wiles mentioned, our foundation aid, which is the aid that's intended to follow every student in New York State, a basic amount of aid. That's going up 0.5%, 0.005 over the current year. That's a grand total of $77,649. In terms of expense-based aids, we're looking at a reduction of $491,000, and that's really due to building aids. We did capital improvements at the middle school back in 2005. We borrowed money to do that, and that bond issue has come to an end, so we don't need to pay any more debt, and associated with the debt is aid, and so the aid reduction is shown as well. And then in terms of fund balance and reserves, we did have to use more than we have in the current budget in order to balance this budget. So we're using an additional $300,000 from what's called a tax certiorari reserve. As part of the reevaluation in Guilderland last year, we had many assessment challenges. So we put some additional money in the budget to cover that. We also have money set aside in a savings account for that purpose, a reserve account. We did not take money from that and use it in the budget last year, but we are recommending to use it this year. In addition to that, we're looking to add another $150,500 from fund balance. And fund balance is the district's savings account, so it's similar to your own personal savings account. We have expenses, and when we can't meet our expenses with the money that we have, we might have to draw down our savings, and that's the idea of fund balance. So it's a pot of money that's savings that we can use and apply to help offset some expenses. In terms of expenditures, we're looking at a substantial increase in private transportation costs, $526,000. We have a shortage of bus drivers. I think everybody's aware that New York State and school districts throughout the country as well are having trouble attracting and retaining bus drivers, and we're no different. We've had to resort to using private contractors to assist us. We've had to do that quite extensively. We have right now under contract 31 schools that we travel to. Some are in close proximity, so we can take students in one geographic area and drop them off at multiple schools that are close by, but 31 schools that we used to service with our own staff, we now have to contract out for. So that is a big increase that we have to deal with for next year. Also, in terms of our BoCEs and private special education placements and services, we're looking at about $165,000 increase. So we have students that have special needs that are better served by facilities outside of the school district. It's the best placement for those children. And as a result, we do have an increase there in terms of the students we're projecting for next year. Teachers' retirement system, there's almost a $400,000 increase next year. There's a rate established by the New York State retirement system. That rate has increased from last year to this year, and that percentage rate is applied to salaries. So if salaries increase and the rate increases, you get a larger number, and that's the instance here where we have additional money that we need to set aside for that purpose. Charter school payments, little surprise here. We've been low in terms of our number of students, relatively low, about 11. We saw an increase of 15 this year, which we're carrying forward to next year. Each of those students, the tuition is about $13,000. So again, with those additional 15 students at that cost, it's another $185,000 that we have to budget for. In terms of our debt payments and something called transfer to capital, it's an overall reduction of just over $1 million. As I mentioned, in the middle school, we had a reduction in building aid. We also have a reduction in debt, and that's primarily the bulk of that. We also had $130,000 that we transferred from our capital fund last year to do a radon mitigation project at the high school. We have completed that project, so we don't need to recontinue that money. So that's an overall reduction, that's part of that overall reduction. Health insurance, fortuitous for us this year in terms of the overall budget context. We've had some good news on health insurance rates. Our Blue Shield premiums are actually going down. Not the same for CDPHP, but Blue Shield is going down. Also, on our prescription drug side, we also have a reduction in premium rates as well. So we have two major sources of health insurance costs where rates are decreasing, and that's going to save us about $240,000. Textbooks, we're not giving up textbooks. We're not buying them for a double negative. But what we did do is we put extra money in the budget last year to do a new elementary math series, as well as a middle school social studies series. They were 6-year subscriptions. We bit the bullet last year. We put them in the budget and did the full 6 years all at once, a one-time expense to hold us over for a few years. But now that money can come back out. We've made that purchase, so that accounts for the reduction in textbooks. In terms of the tax levy, there is one factor in the formula, which I'll go through, and it's around the consumer price index. So as you probably have heard, it's 2% or less in terms of the overall formula for the allowable growth factor. This year, the CPI was 1.8%. Had it been 2% or the maximum, we would have gained another $137,000 under the formula, but because it was under 2%, we had to forego that additional money. And then finally, under the tax levy, a payment in lieu of taxes. We have one property that has a pilot agreement in the town that was reassessed as part of the reevaluation. We captured that increase at the time we did the budget. They then challenged their assessment and had it reduced after we had already adopted the budget. So we're seeing a reduction in that payment amount. In terms of the executive budget proposal, and this is the only proposal we have right now regarding state aid until the legislature adopts the budget, this was Governor Cuomo's first stab at what he would give out in terms of state aid for education. As you can see, it totals $826 million. Most of the school advocate groups recommended in the $2 million range, so it's well shy of what the consensus is for needs in terms of appropriately and properly funding education in New York State. But we have $826 million on the table at this point. $454 million of that is foundation aid, which we've been talking about a little bit in terms of the aid that follows every student. Sound basic education is what it's intended for. And we're getting a smaller and smaller share of that. We've gotten the minimum for the last 3 years, as Dr. Wiles has mentioned. Community schools, which is something that Governor Cuomo started several years ago. He's consistently allocated $15 million to that purpose. And then he also has $200 million for targeted high-need district foundation aid. So part of his overall plan, as he stated, is to drive more aid to higher needs school district. He basically stated that 85% of the foundation aid for next year will be driven towards high needs school districts. We are not a high needs school districts, and therefore we're on the short end of the distribution of those funds. And then in terms of the expense-based aids, the $72 million, there's another wrinkle there. We have several aids that we get reimbursed on based on how much we spend. So transportation, our cost of transportation, BoE services, to name a couple. The more you spend, the more aid you get. The less you spend, the less aid you get. What he's proposing is wrapping those expense-based aids in with foundation aid and creating a pot, if you will. The issue there is those aids may lose their identity. So instead of being aided on formulas that are currently in place, targeting specific expenditures, nobody will be able to determine how much aid you're actually getting for those categories. It's going to all be bundled in and not separated back out again. So, well, as proposed would be a mix of foundation aid, expense-based aids, and we would get a number out of that, and really couldn't go back and look at how our expenses drove certain portions of the aid. And then there's a list of other smaller allocations for aid. Many of the things Governor Cuomo has had in previous years' budgets carrying forward and continued to fund. that again are targeted at certain populations or issues of this nature. We'll move on to the tax levy limit or property tax cap. Most people are familiar with this by now. It's been around for a while. It's an 8-step formula. It was determined by New York State. We didn't have any input into the process, but we do have to follow the formula. As I mentioned previously, the increase in the vast majority of expenses is limited to 1.8%. And really all of the formula is intended to do is determine a threshold amount for voter approval. So if the tax increase is less than the threshold amount, the budget passes with 50% or more of the voters voting yes. If the tax increase as proposed is greater than the threshold amount, even if 50% of the voters say yes, it's not considered to be passed. You have to have what's called a supermajority or 60% of the voters voting yes in that instance to have a passed budget. And then if it's ultimately defeated, and that would usually be twice, you can put it up once and you can choose to put it up again a second time if you wish. If you go through that entire process and the budget is still defeated, no tax levy increase is permitted. So whatever we have in terms of property taxes in the current year, that has to remain, and then you would have to build your budget around that. So in terms of our particular calculation, we start out with the prior year tax levy, which is shown at the top, 73.3 million. There's a tax-based growth factor that's a multiplier that's added in. That really is determined by town growth. So this is new construction within a town, and in every town will get, in school district, will get their own tax-based growth factor. In that case, it increases our number to just over 73.6 million, or about $300,000 as a result of the tax-based growth factor. We have to add in our prior year payment in lieu of taxes, and I mentioned this was our one that was assessed at $259,280, so that's what we had last year. That was the assessment at that time. Then you take out what are called capital expenditures net of state aid. So these are costs particularly associated with borrowing and debt for either school construction or the purchase of school buses. And what we have to do is identify the borrowing costs for those or the debt payments for those, and then we have to subtract out state aid. So that's the net of state aid portion, and put that figure in there. It's a reduction in the calculation. That gets us to what's called our adjusted prior year tax levy of $72.2 million. Now we get to apply the tax levy growth factor, which is a maximum of 2%, or it can be less if the CPI is less. This year the CPI is less at 1%. That gets us to $73.5 million, and at that point we're up in the formula, $1.3 million. Then we have to take out our next year's pilots, so the year-to-year change in the pilot amounts. That's shown as a plus $184,000 because of the way the formula works. You're taking out less than the amount that was shown previously, so we're taking less out, $74,000, than was in before, which is $259,000. So that's in the formula how it becomes a positive number. That gets us to what's called the true tax levy limit, $73.5 million. Then we have to do the same thing again. We'll look at next year's capital expenditures, net of state aid. We get to add that back in. The difference between the $1,659,000 before and the $1,518,000 now below, that's a reduction of $141,000. And that gets us to our maximum allowable tax levy limit of $74,999,995. That's an increase of $1.6 million, or 2.25%. This makes me cry sometimes too when I'm doing it. In terms of next year, our projected budget, we are projecting a budget of $103,534,205. That's an increase of $1,426,830. The overall budget increase is 1.4%. Our estimated tax levy increase is 2.24%. We always show this slide kind of to show the categories of money and funding and where it goes. As you know, we're a people business, and we have a lot of people that perform a lot of functions to serve our students and also to maintain our facilities and transport them, and feed them, and all of the other sort of things that we do in schools. So that's predominantly where the money goes, 79.5% of that. And then we have a number of smaller categories, something called interfund transfers, 0.3%, debt service, so this is borrowing and debt payments, 4.8%. BoE services comprise about 5.9% of the overall budget. Contracted services, 7.3%, and equipment and supplies at 2.2%. So looking at last year's budget compared to this year's budget and where the changes are in terms of our professional salaries, up about 1.3 million. Support staff, very little increase there, just a little over $5,000. Check that number several times just to make sure that was right. We do have on the support side, and these are predominantly non-teaching positions that we have in the school district. One of the things I mentioned before was the increase in private transportation costs, but as we have an increase in the use of private contractors, we will also have an offsetting decrease in terms of the number of drivers and bus attendants that we have. So we have 6 less bus drivers in the budget for next year, 1 less attendant. That's contributing to the lower number there. We also have a number of retirements throughout the district in various categories. We also have turnover in those positions. So every time a person leaves and a new one comes in, typically at a lower cost, we save money as well. And then finally, as Dr. Wiles had indicated, we do have some reductions, which we'll walk through later, that affect the support salary side as well. In terms of employee benefits, that change of just shy of $300,000. Again, we're benefiting a lot from health insurance savings that we typically don't have. In terms of equipment, a reduction of $124,000. As part of the budget, we typically do not roll equipment money forward, so if you have it in the current year, you will need to re-request it if you have the same need or a new need. That was one of the things that we had to take a close look at, and many of those requests funded. Textbooks and supplies, again, a large reduction there, but it's really due to having those 2 textbook subscriptions that we bought last year, having those monies come back in again. Contract services going up about $260,000. BoE services looks like a large increase of just over $1 million. The majority of that is for placements of students in BoE's programs, students with disabilities. We do have some shifts that occur, so we have some in private placements and we have some in BoE's placements. Seems year to year we do have some transition between those 2 programs, and this year there was more of a transition from students that were in private placements, and so there's less projected for next year in private placements, more projected in BoE's placements. In terms of debt service, again, this is related to the middle school project, a reduction there of $916,000. And then in terms of some interfund transfers, reduction of $147,000. And I mentioned that radon mitigation project that was part of that. We don't need to carry that money forward for next year. In terms of the revenue budget, we have a reduction in local sources of revenue. That's predominantly due to lower interest rates, and you all are aware of what's been going on with the economy, particularly lately. But that had started before with a lowering of interest rates, so we're getting less interest than we did last year. Interfund transfers remain the same. State aid and Medicaid, reduction there of $413,000, again, predominantly due to building aid reduction. Appropriated reserves, I mentioned this previously, again, we're taking some money from a reserve for tax certiorari payments, and we're using that to help offset those expenses. That's $300,000. Appropriated fund balance, which I mentioned before, we are at $849,500. We're going to increase that to $1 million. Several years ago, we were at $300,000, so that has increased quite a bit over the last several years in terms of needing that source of savings to help balance the budget. And then in terms of property taxes, we're going to be up $1.4 million. So talking a little bit about fund balance and reserves, it's very important that we keep track of our savings just like you do in your personal lives. You hope to have some savings and you hope to have that available when you need it, but you hope not to have to draw on it too often or continuously, or else you're in a bad financial situation. We do the same thing in school districts. So we would like to have some fund balance or reserves available to help us out when we have these difficult times to help offset expenses. And you can see we were down. This was at the time of the recession. We lost a lot of our fund balance, and then we were able to build that back up over time. Up through 2017-18, we applied a little bit more in 2018-19, but you can see we're about $11 million right now in terms of our fund balance and reserves. We also did a comparison to see how we rate with other school districts in the suburban council and where do we fall in terms of how much fund balance and reserves we have that is a percentage of our overall budget. You can see we're at 14.6%. That places us third right now. You can also see the range here. We are on the bottom of the range, so we don't have as many resources available to help us out when we get into these situations as some other school districts do. So we have, I'll say, a sufficient amount, but it would be better to have more of that available. As you can see, we're starting to use that, so it is a tool and it can go quickly, and it's something that we are unable to sustain over the long term, just like you. If you continually had expenses exceeding your income and you needed to continually take money out of the bank to meet your bills, sooner or later you're going to run out of money in your savings account, and school districts are susceptible to the same risk. In terms of the overall tax impact and tax levy limit, you can see our proposed budget there and our maximum allowable. Right now, this budget is just $5,700 under the tax levy limit, so we're very tight to that threshold. Our tax levy percentage under the budget, 2.24. Our maximum allowable is 2.25, so we're sitting right on the cusp of our tax levy limit. So this, again, 50% voter plurality to have a passed budget. If we were to exceed the tax levy limit, we would need an approval rate of 60%. And talking a little bit about budget voter approval, our community has supported us well over the years, and we appreciate that very much. We did dip down a little bit last year in terms of our yes population, but we've consistently been in that 65 to 70 or almost 75% range, so very good response from the community. You can also see on the right-hand side what our tax levy increase was in terms of a percent and what our tax levy limit is, or was. So sometimes we've been very tight to that. Sometimes we've had a little more room. It all depends on the year and the circumstances and where the tax levy limit falls. But again, in this case, we're going to be very close to the upper limit. So you may ask, well, this tax levy limit issue. So if you have a difficult budget year, why don't you consider exceeding the cap? And you'll notice we haven't mentioned that so far, and that's because we're not recommending that at this time, but why are we not recommending that? So we do have some reductions in the budget, which we're going to go through. They're not ideal, and we would all agree with that. These are difficult decisions to make, and not where we would want to be. But that's the circumstances that we're in and we have to deal with. But we believe the way they've been managed and done is they are manageable and will continue to meet the needs of all learners. We also think a multi-year view is important and having a strategic approach, because we're worried about sustainability. So this is the third year of just that minimal $77,000 or so in terms of foundation aid. We don't see anything changing in the short term, particularly with the governor's push so far to continue to direct more of that aid to needier school districts. So the pot is not getting bigger, the pot's staying the same. More money is going to needier schools, less is going to average wealth schools. And we don't see that changing in the short term. There's nothing to indicate that that's going to change in the short term and may continue for some time. Again, if we fold in some of the other aid categories, the expenditure aid categories, that could be another difficult point for us in having that all absorbed together. So what we think is important is to come up with a strategic approach and look at sustainability over time. Along with that, it would be important to do some outreach engagement with the community so that we can have that conversation. What about long-term sustainability? What about exceeding the cap? And what would that look like? And would it be one time? Would it be multiple times. What's the will of the community in that regard? So we do need to have that conversation. And we only have 28 days between tonight and when we need to adopt the budget, which doesn't make for a lot of time to have a well-done community engagement and outreach on this topic. As you know, with coronavirus and a lot of fear and uncertainty going around, it's impacting earnings, savings, and price of availability of goods and services. So this is an unusual time when we really don't know how this is all going to shake out. And we're unfortunately in this window where we have to prepare and adopt a budget by a law and present it to the voters. So with all of that going on, I think it's difficult for people to fully sit down and look at a long-term strategic approach to funding of schools when they're looking at the stock market going up and down by 2,000 points and things of that sort, maybe looking at the retirement savings and watching it vacillate, wondering whether who's going to have to take time off from work and stay home potentially. A lot of other factors right now that people are concerned with, which would make this community outreach and engagement process very difficult to do in the short term. And then finally, as you are well aware, New York State has an unresolved $6 billion deficit, primarily dedicated to Medicaid. Still there's no plan. That's part of the budget discussions at this point at the state level, is how does the state resolve that? And then what does that mean in terms of the other allocations of state funding? If the state has to cover $6 billion, what does that mean for education aid and all the other categories of need throughout the state of New York? So, and we'll have that answer hopefully a little bit before we adopt our budget. So beginning of April 1st is when the state's supposed to have its budget adopted. We need that information to know how much state aid we get. I think with everything going on, we'll have to see if they can meet the deadline. And then again, how they will address that $6 billion deficit in conjunction with all of the other needs throughout New York State. So talking a little bit about that, when we talk about sustainability over time, looking at things in a multi-year fashion and looking ahead to say, is this a one-year or is this a multi-year issue? So we took a look at the various categories of expense and projected them out. Best information we have, best assumptions we can make at this time. So we're looking at continued growth in salaries over time, as well as employee benefits, and probably a sharper increase in 21-22 because we're getting the benefit of some of those premium rates being lower. We don't anticipate that's going to continue. That is a one-year bump likely, so there will be an extra add for that in 21-22. Equipment, supplies, and textbooks needing to go up as well as contractual services. Our debt pretty level with a little decline in the third year. So we're looking at expenses going up upper threes, 3.75, 3.86, and then 3.61. That's the expenditure side of the equation. In terms of the revenue side, again, very minimal in terms of state aid increases. Local resources, which aren't a big pocket of revenue. Again, we're seeing some reductions there. We're a little concerned about where interest rates are going and borrowing and that sort of thing. Not much movement there. Holding to our current level of appropriated reserves and fund balance. But what we're looking at there on the revenue side of the budget is decline in 2021-22 and just a minimal increase. So what we have is some pretty large increases projected on the expenditure side, really little to no offsetting revenue, which places the burden back on property taxes in order to fund the budget. So in terms of property taxes, our payment in lieu of taxes, we expect to remain the same unless they get reassessed. But our property tax levy, the amount we would need to raise from the taxpayers in order to fund the budget, you can see those percentages there, 5.6%, 5%, 4.6%. So very hefty tax levy increases that we're looking at going ahead if the current climate continues in basically without any significant increases in state aid. And And down below, we're showing you a projection of the 2% tax levy limit growth, so targeting at 2%, and what would that look like? And then we can deduce from that what our potential budget gap is. So we're looking at about 2.7 million, followed by 2.4 million, followed by 2.2 million. So multi-years of budget gaps and deficits that we would have to somehow accommodate. So again, it all ties into that conversation of how do we handle the future, and reductions are part of the conversation. Also, exceeding the tax cap would be part of the conversation, but we probably need more time to engage the community in that process. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Marie for recommendations.
Thanks, Neil. So given the context that Mr. Sanders just described, and looking at our revenue sources, and looking at those places structurally where we could find some additional savings, like health insurance, and in looking at our reserves and our fund balance, the work that we had to do, once that was done, we still had about a $1.3 million gap in our revenues compared to what we needed to expend or wanted to expend. So about 3 weeks ago, I gave the unhappy assignment to the fine folks sitting in the back of the room to look again at their spending plans for 2021 and see if they could find 2% of savings in each of their budgets. So about a week and a half ago, they all submitted their ideas for how we could close that gap. And it was a very difficult exercise, and some of the ideas that they shared with us were really painful. I'll just share like a laundry list of some of those things. They included elimination or reduction of TAs, reduction of co-curriculars, elimination of enrichment programs. Let me see my little list here. Lots of reductions in materials and supplies, changes in athletics, elimination of travel. So the list was very difficult. And in the end, the district office team sorted through their recommendations and tried to come up with ideas that would have the least impact on students and the least reduction of opportunities for our children. So that's what I'm going to share with you right now, and you will see how we're starting. So we began looking at elementary class sections. So the first thing we did was go back to our existing class size guidelines, and we actually used them. Often, when we're presenting the budget at this point year, we are more generous with our class size guidelines, and we look at those sections where there are what we call bubbles, where a classroom might be projected to be within a one student or half a student or right at the guideline, and we would automatically just create the additional section. We did not do that in this budget. We actually used the guidelines, which, as just a reminder, they are K2, 18 to 23 students, and grades 3 through 5, 21 to 25 students. So based on just using our existing guidelines, again, not changing our guidelines, we actually have 5 fewer elementary sections planned for 2021. I want to explain this a little bit because the savings connected with this is only 3 FTEs, or 3 classroom teachers, because 2 of those sections were supported by the use of unassigned teaching positions after the fact. I think it was a kindergarten at Linwood and a 2nd grade at Guilderland Elementary School. So based on our guidelines, we're down 5 sections. We have also reduced the number of unassigned positions in our budget. We typically carry 5. We're recommending carrying 3 going forward. With all of this, in terms of reductions, if you look at our comparative data with our suburban council counterparts, for each grade, K through 5, we are still in the top half of the rankings in class size. So by making this change, we are not, we're still in good standing. in that respect. So I want to just show you how it plays out, and you have a variation of this in your appendices. These are class size averages by building per grade. And you can see far over on the right-hand side is the overall average by grade across the district. Now, I understand averages. I have a colleague who likes to say, you know, your head is in the oven and your feet are in the freezer, but your average, you're at a good temperature. So there is some variation here, but you can see overall where we land. If you see a +1, -1 underneath an average, it means that from last year to this year, we're either adding or subtracting a section, again, in order to get to the guidelines. And if you see an asterisk, for example, on the first line, Linwood has projected a 23 student per class in kindergarten with an asterisk, which means that from the point at which we adopt a budget, we are watching the enrollment in that classroom almost daily. Our